I'm going to correct Rugby. I still am a doctor. I'm just making a different type of house call right now. And come on, that wasn't that bad. And also, just wanted to correct David when he said, President Kennedy quoted, every mother wants their son or daughter to be president of the United States. I'm Indian American. They want their son or daughter to be a doctor. So that was pretty. I got you guys to laugh at that one. But you know what? You could be a doctor first and then run for Congress, right? So we're checking all the boxes here. It's interesting when I first had this notion of running, and it really came on the heels of 2007 was a pretty unique time in presidential politics. We got involved in President Obama's campaign fairly early on at a time when we were trying to fundraise and support President Obama, at that time Senator Obama. Most folks would just look at us and say, a charismatic figure gives a good speech, but it's going to be Hillary Clinton or John Edwards, if you remember John Edwards back then. But he tapped into this energy, this aspiration of how do we start healing the nation? Maybe it was too early in his time, but there was a component of that that got me thinking. And pretty early on, after he won the presidency, I sat down with my wife and said, you know what? I'm thinking about running for Congress. And she just looked at me and said, don't say that publicly to anyone because people are just going to laugh at you. And it wasn't because I hadn't accomplished a lot. I was a physician, had been medical director of a 5-hospital system in our community, was chief medical officer of the county, was dean of admissions at UC Davis Medical School, so I knew all of our local electeds. It was, you've never done that before. You don't see, it's a predominantly Caucasian community, somewhat Republican leaning, and you didn't see people who looked like me out there running. But so I went and started talking to all my local electeds, all my friends in state politics, and to a T, everyone said, with your background in healthcare, everything that you've done, you'd be a great member of Congress. And then the next sentence was, why don't you run for city council? And it's like, well, I'm not going to work on healthcare from the city of Elk Grove. That's not where they're determining this. And it really is that initial piece of overcoming that. Well, there aren't that many people that look like you, or there. How are you going to run against a long-time incumbent? You've never run for public office before, and I haven't. All of us, whether you're first generation, born and raised in America, or fifth generation, our families came from somewhere. And when I think about my parents' story, it's not that they didn't take risks; they took huge risks, leaving a small town in Gujarat to come to the United States, to a country where they didn't know anything. And that's probably a story that runs through. So life is not about being risk averse and taking the safe path. Life is, if you see something and called to do something, finding your voice and not being afraid to put yourself out there. And that's what I did. And I didn't know what was going to actually happen. But what happened was we ran one of the closest races in 2010. If you remember 2010, it wasn't a great year to be a Democrat running for Congress. But it was a remarkable experience, and I learned a lot, met wonderful people, went to different areas in my community that I hadn't seen, and really just created a huge grassroots campaign. And we ran again in 2012, and I got elected, and now I'm in my 3rd term. And it's never been easy. Again, I run on the story of my family. I run on the story of who I am, the values that we were raised with as coming from an immigrant family, because I actually think that is what makes America such a special place. And I think that is actually why I got elected. Again, I'm not in a predominantly Asian district. It's a predominantly Caucasian district. It's pretty even, one of the most evenly split districts in the country, Democratic versus Republican. But it's those values that I think get me elected. So one of the first speeches I did, after getting elected, was to the first Indiaspora presidential gala. And what I said at that juncture, I was the only Indian American member of Congress, and really laid out the challenge that said, you know, over this next decade, we should go from 1 member of Congress to 5 members. Well, it didn't take us 10 years, did it? It took us 4 years, and we're at 5 members. We're at our first senator. So there's nothing that suggests, you know, we wait another decade to double that number, to go from 5 to 10. If you look at it, you know, you have rising stars all across this country. You're going to see a rising star in the Attorney General of New Jersey, who's going to make waves and probably pick up the ball at a national level, you know, holding our president accountable. You have remarkable candidates like Harold Chippernick running in Arizona, stepping up. And there's probably other candidates in this room, like Aftab running in Ohio. And what we need to do as a community is take it to the next level, right? I mean, if you think about what the Indian American diaspora has accomplished in America, we're now the most affluent demographic in America. We're the most educated demographic in America. We're about 1% of the population, but 8% of the physicians and surgeons in America. Yet we're just getting started, you know, in terms of political representation. But I think this is going to accelerate with the next generation, because we raised our children not to be afraid, but to absolutely say, well, why shouldn't I have a seat at the table? And I think that's important. And it's not just elected office. You know, when my first introduction in Washington, D.C. was as an intern after my sophomore year of college, working for Senator Alan Cranston. I'm not going to lie, I didn't see anyone who looked like me on the Hill, and saw very few Asian Americans. Well, fast forward today, you have Indian American chiefs of staffs, you know, folks working in the administration all across this place, and that's another way to serve. And you know, I think it is very important now that we also get politically engaged in how do you support those candidates. As David mentioned in his opening comments, it's not easy to get elected. You need, you know, one, putting your name on the ballot takes a lot, but you can't do this by yourself. And I think that's where we have to be strategic as a community. How do we identify those candidates that are running? How do we support those candidates that are running? And when I say support, that is opening up your checkbook and writing a check to those candidates, because the truth of the matter is most of the folks in our community, maybe the younger generation, but most of the folks in our community are not going to go out and knock on doors and make phone calls. And that's not when those candidates ask you for help. They're not asking you to, they're asking you to open up your checkbook. And if we do want to have a seat at the table, if we do want to go from 5 to 10 members of Congress, it is going to be supporting them financially. And I think that's why Impact is such an important project. The other thing that we have to move off of is, I will tell you, since I make a lot of these calls to folks, many people, it's easy for members of our community to open up the checkbook and write a $30,000 check to take a picture with the President of the United States or a presidential candidate. It is pulling teeth to get them to write you a $250 check, that same person. You don't get any political impact of that picture. You get to brag to your friends that, hey, I've got a picture with the president, but you don't have a seat at the table. And if we want to have a seat at the table, we need to mature politically. And I would take a page out of the Jewish American community. They very strategically go out and support candidates. They very strategically don't play huge in presidential politics. They strategically play in congressional politics, because members of Congress are not here for 4 years or 8 years. They're here for an extended period of time. They strategically get to know their members of Congress back in their home district. So we're here to support other Indian American members of Congress, but if we want to have a seat at the table, you need to get to know your own member of Congress, Democrat or Republican, back home, so you can talk about the issues that we care about. So when we're talking about H-1Bs and when we're talking about DACA, we're also talking about kids that are here legally who may get kicked out of this country, and we're standing up for those kids. But that only happens if you're politically engaged. So we're also working on another project, both on the campaign side but also on the official side, where we do think the Indian American community and the Jewish American community ought to be working more closely together. Because truly, if you look at the values that we have, the values of family, the values of hard work, of education, And I'm a Democrat, so we're both predominantly Democratic communities, not all. There's a lot of synergy and overlap. From a strategic perspective, you're seeing stronger ties between India and Israel. India is the leading democracy in its part of the world. Israel is the leading democracy in its part of the world, and obviously we're the leader of democracy around the world. So we do think the diasporas have the ability to also bring the countries closer together to fight for the values that we care about. So now's not a time to sit on the sidelines. Now's actually a time to identify those candidates that are finding the courage to put themselves out there and support those candidates. And again, I think having an organization like Impact that is able to help guide you to some of those candidates, allow you to get to know some of those candidates, and when they're calling you, open up those checkbooks, because again, it doesn't do us any good to be the most affluent community in America if we don't have a seat at the table. So I don't know if you want me to take a couple questions. I'm going to have to head back to the Hill in a second, or if you're ready for the next speaker. Okay, Priya, come on.